then related to these, perceptions of extremes, what is an Overton window? And actually, this is one that I don't know. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about on the show, sometimes I know the answer, and this is one that I don't know the answer to, and I'm really excited to hear what it is because the only podcast that I listen to is a show called Last Week in AI, and it's a news show. So it's a weekly news show where they cover the last week's AI news, and it's unlike this show, which assumes that our primary audience is technical. That one they assume that actually, they don't talk. They do talk about like open source tools and stuff. They're not talking so much about getting into the nitty gritty details of them, but more so about like what this open source tool impact is going to have on society. And they frequently talk about the Overton window in the context of artificial general intelligence coming about. And I haven't looked into it yet, so I don't know if we're going to figure that out right now. But
well, that's interesting. Well, I'll talk a little bit about the Overton window, and then maybe we can figure out the connection with AGI. Let's see. So the term comes from political science, and it describes the set of political ideas that are considered mainstream at any point in time. That if you are inside the window, your ideas are acceptable to the voting population. And if you're at the edge of the window, you're starting to be, maybe acceptable or not. And then at the extremes, you are radical or extreme. And the theory in the context of politics is that politicians are by and large good at figuring out where the Overton window is and positing ideas that will be accepted. So that is one of the ways that politicians track public opinion. What I wrote about in the book is a thing that I'm calling the Overton paradox, and I'm kind of making up that name. So we'll see if it turns out to be like a name, but I just wanted to use it as a way to refer to this phenomenon. And there are a couple of parts of this, and I have to say it's a little bit hard to explain without having the figures to show, but let me attempt it. I looked at data from the General Social Survey, and the design of the survey is really useful for tracking things like the Overton window. How have public opinions changed over time? Because they started in the 1970s, and every year or two, they ask a representative sample of adults in the US a common core of questions, and many of them are about political views. So the first thing I wanted to look at is when we talk about conservative or liberal, what are we talking about? What are the questions that distinguish those groups? So I picked the people who self-identify as conservative or liberal, and I found the 15 questions where they are most different from each other. And I won't try to list them, but I bet you can guess what they are. It's all of the topics that are, topics of current political discussion. And then I wanted to see how that changes over time and how it changes with age. Now, over time, it was not super surprising. By and large, most questions have been trending in the liberal direction for the last 50 years. So one of the examples is about homosexuality. Do you think that same-sex sex is wrong? That's not the exact wording of the question, but it's something like that. And the fraction of people who think that that's wrong has gone down steeply during the last 50 years, especially starting in 1990. So things have trended toward liberal. At the same time, if you compare young people and old people, you will find that old people are more conservative than young people. That's sort of what you'd expect. And if you look at the data, it is absolutely true. Now we come to the first question, which is, what happens as people age? So if old people are more conservative, does that mean that young people will get more conservative over time as they get older? And let me ask what you think. Do you think that people get more conservative as they age?
Yeah, this is so interesting, and I'm so glad you asked because it's the kind of thing that I think about this all the time. You've touched on so many topics in your book that are so fascinating to me, and yeah, this is one of the things that I think about a lot. And it ties into this this thing that I think about people in general, and I guess it is kind of this Overton window idea, which is that we all, we all, there are some whatever genetic behavioral traits that we inherit, but most of our opinions about the world are things that we've learned. And over the course of our lifetime, we meet certain people that sway us one way or the other. We read a book or a blog post or whatever, and these things gradually like shift our opinions. Um, but on an individual basis, that shift, you could in some ways, like those kinds of questions you're asking, you could, and I guess that's what we're getting into, you could longitudinally ask somebody over their whole lifetime, and in some people there will be some shift. Maybe we're going to find out that people do shift towards conservative a little bit, or something like that. But then what's even more interesting to me is the idea of looking at how these things change, like the distribution of these opinions over time over a larger group, because it it seems to me like so many behavioral phenomena in the world are driven by this. Like, where are we going with politics? And and that's going to be determined. If you were in 1990 or pre 1990 or 1950, it seems reasonable to me, or it seems obvious to me, that if you're a conservative political party, you're going to have more conservative views in 1950 than you do today.
Mhm.
Because if you have the same views of the Conservative Party in 1950, you would be so far out of the Overton window, no one would ever elect you. There's just no, there's people with those views, no doubt, alive, but
Mhm.
they're not very likely to become a politician or to succeed as a politician.
Mhm.
And so, it's this interesting. So like that question, like openness to homosexuality. Um, Clearly that is something that is changed. I was born in 1985, and I have witnessed this dramatic change in
Mhm.
perceptions, in what you see on television and in news and on TV. And um, yeah, it's been this dramatic change that I've been able to see over the decades that I've been alive. And yeah, it's a perfect example of this. It kind of gives us this way to project into the future, to some
Mhm.
extent, as to what society will be like in the future. Because to some extent, I suspect that these things will continue to move liberally. But yeah, back to your original question. I think that I suspect that for most of the questions that you've looked at, or for many of the questions that you've looked at, people probably do shift a little bit more conservatively. And I think it's driven by things like, like maybe not the homosexuality one is a specific example, but so for example, when you're very young, when you're a college student or high school student, you don't have much of a stake in the system.
Mm.
And so young people think, capitalism is bad and we've got to change. There's got to be something new. Bitcoin is the way, or, anarchy or whatever. But then, you know, you get a mortgage, you've got savings in a bank account, that stuff accumulates more and more over your lifetime. You're bought into the system.
Mhm.
It tends to happen as you get older. And so I think on some issues, this will mean that some people become more conservative. Like you're less likely to maybe want high taxes in that kind of scenario,
Mhm.
or you're more likely to be against estate taxes.
Mhm.
Uh, whereas when you're young, these seem like great things. Like let's fund more education, let's fund more social services, let's have a more equitable world. Um, yeah. So I don't know. So I think that some of the questions, some people become more conservative over time because they tend to get more bought into the system.
Mhm.
But then, yeah, I think on maybe other kinds of questions like homosexuality, like I actually think that I think people might continue to become more liberal on a question like that over time because when, to go to an extreme, if you're in a culture where it's illegal to be homosexual, then there's going to be very little discussion of it, except as maybe like, oh, that's bad. Don't talk about that. It's bad. Um, but then as things start to open up, you start to realize, oh, society hasn't imploded. And oh, I work with so and so who's homosexual, and they're great. And oh, I had a kid that's homosexual, and that's great. I love them too. It's like so with those kinds of issues. So yeah, so I guess yeah, I've given you a very long, complex answer, but I think for some issues, people will become more conservative. On other issues, they will become more liberal, and it's based on these kinds of there's these kinds of underlying factors that might generalize that I've identified.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, you hit the trifecta, because what the chapter is about is age period cohort analysis, and you described an age effect, a period effect, and a cohort effect
Okay.
perfectly.
Okay.
So, an age effect is something that happens to people over the course of their lives, sometimes for biological reasons, and sometimes because of their stage of life. And you conjectured that people might become more conservative on economic issues because they are bought into the system, or they might become more liberal on social issues because their horizons broaden and they experience more things. Absolutely, those could be age effects, and those things are clearly happening. A period effect is something that causes an entire group of people to be influenced by something that is happening at a period of time. And it can be a single event, like the terrorist attacks of September 11, or it can be something that is happening in the media. And so the changes in attitudes about homosexuality are a good example of a period effect. Basically, all groups have become more tolerant during the same period since roughly 1990. And you also mentioned the possibility of a cohort effect, which is depending on when you are born, your birth cohort is the group of people that you were born with, your generation or decade of birth. That is going to influence the experiences that you have growing up and the people around you and so on. So all three of those effects are happening. And in some sense, it's a race to see which ones are going faster or slower than the others. And that's the foundation of the Overton paradox, which is a race between the period effect, which I mentioned, which is that the average is tending toward liberal over time. And it's happening within all groups. Particularly, you mentioned, what does that distribution look like? If you split people up by liberal, moderate, and conservative, all three groups are trending liberal at almost the same rate. It has spread out just a little bit. So that is a kind of polarization, but it's not a very big effect.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the key thing. It has changed enough over time that if you look at these 15 questions that I selected, a conservative now is indistinguishable from a liberal in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
So if you took a time machine,
Mm-hmm.
you went back to 1970 and you selected an average liberal and you brought them to a Y2K party.
Mm-hmm.
Happy New Year. It's the year 2000. Compare them to their surroundings. They would be indistinguishable from a moderate in the year 2000.
Mm-hmm.
And if you brought them to 2023, they would be indistinguishable from a conservative in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
So they would be standing there in their tie-dye and their peace medallion, and they would show up at the Republican National Convention, and they would fit right in.
That's such a good visual.
So, so
That's great.
that's the time travel experiment.
Yeah.
And now here's the thing. That is exactly what happened to people who were born in the 1930s. In 1970, when they were first interviewed in the General Social Survey, they were on average about as liberal as the average 1970 liberal. And over the course of their lives, they gradually became slightly more liberal. And that's almost every generation does the same thing. So all of those effects that you mentioned, they almost cancel out. by and large, within each cohort, people become a little bit more liberal over the course of their lives, but quite slowly. The age effect is very slow, and the period effect is substantially faster. And the result is that someone who is liberal relative to the center of the road in 1970 will find themselves in the 2020s right of center.
Right.
And if
Oh.
you ask them,
Oh.
are you liberal or are you conservative? People are more likely to say that they are conservative,
Oh, really?
but they are more likely to be liberal over the course of their lives.
Hmm.
And the reason is that the center of mass moves faster than most people.
Right.
One way to think about this is you are being chased by the Overton window,
Right.
and most people will lose that race.
Right.
So
Wow. 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 Wow.
even if your views are unchanged over the course of your life, you will find yourself gradually more and more right of center because the center moves.
Yeah, that's really cool. I've really loved this whole discussion on this Overton window. This has been, yeah, super, super interesting. And it ties in, yeah, like I said, this is something that I think about a lot. And one of the reasons why I think about it so much, and it ties in perfectly into that point that you just made about how the Overton window is chasing us, like the center is moving faster than we do. It's I don't know, something. I meditate a fair bit.
Mhm.
I have a daily meditation practice. Sometimes it's just 5 minutes, but as often as I can, I try to do it for half an hour and actually like sitting on the couch cushion and properly not being distracted for that half hour by outside events. And one of the things that comes to mind a lot is in those states is how and I think a lot of mindfulness practices are explicitly about bringing this about are realizing that your thoughts are not you, that you you are not your thoughts just pass through you. And so this is interesting because in a lot of waking life, it's kind of in the meditation practice I'm like, okay, I'm not my thoughts, but then as I go about my life, generally it's kind of hard to shake that. Like you kind of I have this idea that I am a certain person and I have certain thoughts, I have particular political views, that is me. um, but yet, all of this thing that is me, I know is going to change, and it's going to change as a result of how people change around me. People becoming much more liberal, young people. I'm 38, but I actually have quite a few friends that are in their early 20s, and they are there's things that they do, then perspectives that they have that are more liberal than the people that I grew up with and that I still hang out with today. But the more I'm around them, the more I'm going to have their kind of perspective. And because a lot of what they're saying does make sense. They're much more likely to be vegan.
Mhm.
And I'm like, well, it's kind of obvious that treating sentient beings, pigs are one of the most intelligent species on the planet, and we've got them locked up in small cages and they have these horrible existences, and that's bad. And yet I'm eating pork. And
Mhm.
I know that I probably shouldn't be eating meat. And I'm like, oh, I hope that there will be great meat alternatives. Like, I love meat alternatives. But I'm in, for whatever reason, because I was raised eating meat, I'm in this habit of continuing to do it. And I'm like, and I make excuses for it. I'm like, well, I work out a lot. How am I going to gain muscle? I don't know many other people who are able to gain muscle without eating meat.
Mhm.
So I'm like, well, I'll wait for meat alternatives. But meanwhile, there's this other part of me that's like, well, maybe you'd have to be much more strategic about your protein sources and how you're eating, but you could probably be vegan if you put more effort into it. And isn't that worth the animal lives that you would be saving? So anyway, there's these kinds of
Mhm.
things that on any kind of given issue, they kind of come about. And so you're just, yeah, it's interesting how, you generally go around through your life with this sense that like you are someone, but it's all quite ethereal and it's all changing. And yeah, with these kinds of population level um, distribution analyses,
Mhm.
you can have a sense of who you're going to be in the future,
Mhm.
uh, or the probability of who you're likely to become.
Yeah. Well, part of what you said is related to one of the earlier chapters, which is about the moral circle and moral progress. And it's a possible answer to the question if our beliefs on these 15 questions, or more broadly, political and social and economic beliefs, trend toward liberal over time. Is that just the most recent 50 years? Is it because of the data set that I looked at, or is that a bigger historical phenomenon?
Yeah.
And there's certainly evidence that it is a bigger phenomenon. People who have written about the moral circle include Peter Singer and Steven Pinker. And the observation is that over time, the, the sphere of moral rights that we extend gets bigger, that it historically might have been very narrow. It would be people like me. And then it comes to include people who are more and more dissimilar on all different axes: sexual, racial, political. Just as it becomes more and more inclusive, we extend rights and respect toward more and more people. And then at some point to animals as well. And it tends to be a ratchet effect that by and large, for example, once we have decided that slavery is morally unacceptable, it is very unlikely that we as a society will wake up sometime in the future and say, oh no, that was a terrible mistake. Actually, slavery is okay. We should resume that practice. It doesn't tend to go that way. And in fact, it's almost strange to look back at debates about whether slavery is okay or not. Like that question is so far outside the Overton window, it's
Mm-hmm.
just bizarre to think that it was ever in the Overton window.
Yeah.
But at the same time that we can easily look back 50 years and find people who seem shockingly immoral by contemporary standards, we have to ask the question, what are we doing now? What are the things that we are currently debating
Exactly.
that are going to seem
Exactly.
incomprehensibly horrible
Yeah.
in the not too distant future? And I suspect that the way that we treat farm animals is going to be high on that list.
Absolutely. I think there's no doubt in my mind that that's the case. I think I think my grandchildren will be appalled that I was eating the flesh of a sentient being. And yeah, I genuinely like it's one of these things. It's like, yeah. Anyway, we've already talked about it enough for a data science podcast, but yeah, it's like it's so obviously wrong to me already, and yet there's this lag of habit and culture that means that I still am doing this thing that I know, yeah, is morally wrong. Anyway, yeah, that's the most obvious one. It'll be interesting to see some of the other ones. And yeah, so tying back to, it's interesting. We did actually make really great progress through all of my questions for you up until now. Now we've really dug deep into this Overton one, but I hopefully a lot of our listeners find it as fascinating as I think you and I clearly do. Um, and so let's now tie that to the artificial general intelligence thing, which I I think I have an idea for what they mean there, and it's maybe easier for me because I've been listening to the co-hosts of Last Week in AI, Jeremy and Andre, talk about this Overton window a number of times. So I think I have some sense, which is that it's people's maybe there's if you asked a general audience, it probably doesn't make sense as like a political question for like your general for the 2024 U.S. presidential election, but what people think about AGI might make sense in the data science community, certainly among AI researchers. It probably is the kind of question you could ask. You could ask you or me, what do you think the probability is of AGI being an existential risk event, in the next 5 years or 10 years or 50 years? So I think that's what they're referring to, that there's like kind of an Overton window of like what people expect. And then there's people on, uh, yeah, maybe extremes far outside that Overton window that are relatively rare.
Yeah, I think I see the connection there. It's an interesting one. I think I need to think more about it.
Yeah, you know a lot more about the Overton window than me, so it could be like my naivete that allows me to take a well-established concept and say, and just use it, wield that hammer on various phenomena. Nice. Yeah. So, yeah, my final question on this Overton window thing is, and I think you might have already answered it, but with a population aging in most of the developed world, what does that do to the Overton window? And I think based on the discussion we've already had, I can probably speculate pretty well that it means things are going to continue to get more liberal.
They will, possibly at a slightly slower rate,
Mm-hmm.
because one of the things that drives that trend is the euphemistically named generational replacement, which is a nice way of saying that old people die and are replaced by young people.
Mm-hmm.
And if the young replacement is more liberal than the old person who died, that is one of the things that changes the average over
Mm-hmm.
time. And so, in an aging population where that process is being stretched out a little bit, you have people who are living longer. And so, in some sense, they are dragging the average down for a longer
Right.
period of time. And
Right.
fewer people are being born. And so, their contribution to the average is diluted a little bit. But I don't think that that's going to be a huge effect. That might slow things down a little bit. But I also think that there's a countervening effect, which is I think that some of the period effects are getting stronger because of interconnectivity and the
Right.
availability of information.
Totally.
If you look at the question that we've been talking about, because I think it's a nice example, is acceptance of homosexuality. If you compare, let's say a 10-year-old me in 1977 to a 10-year-old now and think about what is their awareness of even just what homosexuality is, what the attitudes toward it are. They are infinitely more knowledgeable now than I was long before the internet existed. And I think that's true of religion as well. Like one's awareness of world religions is
Mhm.
vastly different now. And so on so many dimensions, I think that availability, not just of information, I don't mean like reading Wikipedia, but the access to people that
Mhm.
you can have conversed with people who are in different countries, different religions, different everything.
Yep.
That's a very different world, and that's going to drive period effects.
For sure. And those friends of mine that are in their early 20s, they get a huge amount of their information on culture from TikTok and
Mhm.
Instagram Reels and
Which is
YouTube
global.
Shorts, and yeah, which is global and which exposes them very quickly to such a broad range of perspectives. Uh, yeah, and yeah, I think there's yeah, there could be some good things that come out of social media use, I suppose. Like people
Yeah.
finding great podcasts like Super Data Science.
No, that's right. And, there is certainly accumulating evidence about the negative effects of social media. So I don't mean to dismiss that. I think that that's a serious thing. But
Yeah,
I do think there are positive effects in terms of exposure to a much bigger world than pre internet.